in a theater somewhere could probably kill everybody in that theater or that stadium within a few minutes. A little drop of, VX on your skin, just one drop will kill you in 2 minutes. And if you breathe it in or ingest it, it'll even be faster. Yeah.
When you talked about the amount of chemicals in these places, were they actually weaponized chemicals, or were these just stockpiles of said chemicals?
It varied from stockpile to stockpile.
Okay.
I couldn't give you exact numbers. Most of it is, I think the majority of it is weaponized.
Okay.
But there are stockpiles like Newport, Indiana, I think right in the middle there. I think Newport was all bulk storage of VX. And bulk storage, of course, as we can talk about later in Syria, if it's bulk stored in drums, basically big drums, big containers, it could be large ones, what we call ton containers,
right.
Or it could be small ones like pails. I'll show you a picture of it.
Right.
Can be demilitarized and destroyed much more easily. If it's weaponized, depends on the weapon, but if the weapon includes rocket propellant, explosives, burster caps, rocket motors, and all the rest, it becomes extremely difficult to destroy, very dangerous as well. There are a couple of you had your hand up.
Well, I had a question on the previous slide when you
Let's see if I can go back here.
Countries.
Yeah.
What's about China? They don't have it or just don't declare it? I have a hard belief that they don't have anything.
China has joined the Chemical Weapons Convention as a non-possessor state. So as far as we know, and I've heard nothing to the contrary really, they don't have chemical weapons. They did at one point. A lot of countries had chemical weapons at one point, but destroyed them somehow before the convention entered into force. So you'll find these declared stockpiles are only what's been declared to the OPCW when they joined the treaty. But we thought Russia's stockpile was much larger to begin with. China had a stockpile at one point. What China does have is they have old buried Japanese chemical weapons that the Japanese left there after World War II. And now there's a big operation, what we call non-stockpile, or old and abandoned chemical weapons that the Japanese are working on with the Chinese to survey, excavate, and destroy. It's a very dangerous, very tedious project that they have to shut down every winter because it's mostly in very cold regions of China. But they've destroyed to date about 40,000, 45,000 weapons, I think, in China, and they have another probably 700,000 or 800,000 to go. It's going to go on for decades to come. And there's no love lost, probably because of this, between the Chinese and the Japanese at all. Yeah. You had a question, and then, is there one over, did I see a hand over here? Hopefully not, then I can keep going.
Yeah. Regarding to this slide, what would be the reason for one single country to make it confidential that possessing these chemical weapons? Because I'm from South Korea, and this is my first time to hear that.
It is. That's interesting. Yeah. South Korea, there's a lot of theories why South Korea is so secretive about it. The South Koreans had a large stockpile. I mean, 1,000 tons is about the size of the Syrian stockpile. It may have been larger. And one theory is that they don't want to have much publicity because of the large remaining North Korean stockpile. North Koreans, we know, have a very large stockpile. Another theory is that they're worried about domestic citizen outrage that they ever had a chemical weapons stockpile, or perhaps even that they destroyed it, because of the North Korean threat. And a third reason, sometimes given, is that their stockpile was very new and looked exactly like the newest American stockpile. And so it was probably provided by the United States prior to the convention, so wouldn't have been illegal back then, but wouldn't have been very nice either if people knew about that. So I don't know what the reason is. I keep talking to the South Korean diplomats and saying, it's a success story. You destroyed your stockpile. They completed, I think, in 2009. Why don't you talk about it? It would be good news for the OPCW. India too. India tells everyone they had a stockpile, they've destroyed it, but they won't say the numbers, they won't say where it is, they won't say what it was. All of us know a little bit about it, but not to the extent we know about the Russian and American stockpiles, and the Albanian and the Libyan ones too. So it's interesting, if you have Korean, mention it to your Korean family or friends back home and say, why isn't Korea talking about the elimination of its stockpile? So let me keep moving here. We can come back, but we still have a long way to go. The Russian stockpile, seven stockpiles declared, all of them very large. I've been in every single one of them. Not a pleasant experience, believe me. Gas mask and all. 6 of these, except for the one on the far right, and that's a place called Syria that Greg mentioned earlier, that I first visited in 1994, either fortunately or unfortunately. But it certainly got me involved in this issue. All the rest of them to the west are west of the Urals. So if you look at the Ural mountain range, it's sort of right here. That's the Ural mountain range, so anything west of there is really Eurasia, and anything east of there is really the steppes of Siberia. The stockpile I first went to, July 1994, was right on the steppes of Siberia. It was a 3-hour flight east from Moscow, and then a 2-hour drive from a place called Chelyabinsk that some of you may know had the meteor hit, I think about a year ago. A very remote area, really poor agrarian, subsistence-based, flat steppes, very unique area. And we were, in 1994, we were pleased on the one hand that the Russians back then were completely open and brought in this large American delegation. We had an Assistant Secretary of Defense, we had 2 congressmen from U.S. stockpile sites, as well, 2 senior congressmen now retired from the House of Representatives. And we went through the whole stockpile. You know, it was really an amazing experience. But the challenge was, we recognized back then, and remember this is almost 20 years ago now, recognized back then there was almost no security on the stockpile. They had a little chain link fence around it. It was big corrugated metal and wooden buildings in the middle of a forest, amongst 14 little villages with 40,000 Russian peasants. And the little, 16-year-old army private at the front gate who told me he hadn't been paid in 6 months, and he was delighted that we were there because they gave him 3 months of his 6 months back pay. And they had big swinging barn doors in the buildings with a bicycle padlock, and holes in the windows and holes in the ceiling. No inventory. No, and I'll show you a couple pictures later of it, but no inventory, with over 2 million artillery shells in this site and 1,000 missile warheads, very similar to what we see in Syria today. So in '94, we actually, when I was on the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, we wrote a classified memo when we came back to the Secretary of Defense at that point, said, we have to work with the Russians at this point immediately to get first security on this site and the similar site to it. There's another site called Kiesner. Kiesner is right in the middle, there you can see, just below a place called Izhevsk. You probably can't see the words on but Kiesner is still there. Syria now is about 60% destroyed. Kiesner is still alive and kicking, as they say. The Russians are still building the destruction facility. But I'll talk more about that later. These are the type of weapons we're looking at. This was a picture I took, 2 pictures in 2002 when we did a groundbreaking ceremony for the destruction facility in Syria in Siberia. And we had about 250 press there. This is the middle of nowhere. We flew everybody in, we bussed them 2 hours to this site. And the Americans had sort of adopted this site and worked with the Russians at that point. This is 8 years after we first went to Syria. So I had been there probably 10 times at that point. And we had dewatered about 50 acres of land, took down 30,000 trees. So those of us in the environmental community were a little bit concerned about tree replanting and things like that. But we were trying to get other countries to join in and help the Russians build the facility. So this was a big international event. They had a Russian marching band there. But the funny little story I'll tell you is Jill Doherty, some of you may know, who's a well-known CNN reporter. You still see all the time. She came on the trip amongst many others. We had the New York Times, Washington Post, and she picked up one of those artillery shells you see on the right, and she was talking into the camera, doing a live shoot. And she said, of course, these weapons are training weapons that the Russian chemical forces use to train their troops with. And the commanding officer you see there leaned over to her and said, these aren't training, we don't have training weapons, because we don't use these anymore. You know, they're not integrated into the Army anymore. He said, these are real weapons. And she said, you mean this has what inside it? He said, VX nerve agent. And she kind of took it up and placed it back down, you know, very carefully, live on CNN at the time. And we all, I mean, we were right there, we heard it, and we thought, my God, you know, this site was 20 kilometers away from the stockpile. So they moved these enormous Frog and Scud missile warheads and all these artillery shells with live VX nerve agent up these old, you know, dirt roads, 20 kilometers to this site. I thought, you know, anyone here in the United States in security would have a heart attack, you know, moving this stuff around in places like this. Anyway, give you an idea of what we were dealing with back then. This is what the stockpile looked like. So when I asked the commanding officer, I said, how do you count? You know, how do you keep track of these weapons? You have them all barcoded or something? He said, no, we keep the doors locked. You know, and I said, but there's just a bicycle padlock on the door. And the windows, somebody could break in a window, you know. Do you ever think you've lost any of these things? He said, oh, no, we keep the doors locked, it's no problem at all. So we were really, I said, how many do you have? He said, 2 million, give or take a couple thousand, you know. And so you can imagine our thinking back then.